never ends.
You know what? It doesn't matter if you love or hate Gears 5. The truth of the matter is that Gears 5 is in fact a dying game on life support, and I never imagined this franchise, that was at one time considered to be one of the greatest in all of gaming, could reach a point this low. Yes, I realize that Gears 5 managed to crush it with critics and reviewers when the game was first released. But if you look at the game now, the player base is almost non-existent on PC, and on Xbox it's still in a nosedive. Now there are many reasons for this, such as the gaming market being oversaturated, the Xbox One being outsold by a landslide compared to PlayStation, and the Gears of War franchise no longer being a heavy hitter. But all these reasons shouldn't have affected the game's sales and its consumer reception. The gaming market is indeed oversaturated, but as we've seen when you make fantastic sequels to an older franchise like the newest God of War, a game can still sell well, bring new life and popularity to an IP, and be well received by consumers and critics alike. Now when Gears 5 first came out, many reviewers all claimed this game was effectively Xbox's God of War, and on the surface it seemed like this was true. Gears 5, like God of War, was going to be one of the best games visually this generation, include small semi-open world segments, and of course include giant monsters for us to kill. Along with those features, the developers and critics alike all told fans pre-release that this was the most innovative and modern entry in the series, and that it would definitely be the biggest and best Gears game yet. Well, I can happily say that at least one of those four buzzwords accurately describes Gears 5. It certainly is the most innovative Gears game yet, but some of those innovations have caused Gears 5 to fail at being a Gears game. This is what I think is the major cause of Gears 5's recent failures, and the cause of the game's troubled attempt to garner a large audience. With Gears 5, the Coalition has introduced a plethora of changes to the franchise, such as a new protagonist, downgraded and cartoony gore, a drastically different soundtrack, a lack of weight and destruction to gameplay, a change of tone in the marketing and the game itself, the introduction of pointless crossovers, and finally, Gears no longer feels mature and instead feels more childish. All of these changes have undoubtedly been done to try and broaden Gears 5's potential audience, but in by doing so, the Coalition has alienated the fans of the franchise, who are the people responsible for spreading good word of mouth and keeping the game alive for years after release. Hell, you can still find Gears of War 3 matches more than 8 years later. Why? Because the game was that damn good, and made almost every single fan happy. Yet here in Gears 5, if you take a stroll through the game's Reddit, or even the official forums, the overwhelming majority of posts and threads are negative and criticize Gears 5. And those people creating those posts and forums are the fans. Now we the fans aren't criticizing the game in the hopes that the studio shut down and that the IP is put on ice. Trust me, no one wants the Gears franchise to die, or for a whole studio of people to lose their jobs. But just like 343 Industries and Halo 5, the fifth entry by a new studio has proven to be divisive and deviate away from the older games. And we the fans can either let this continue until Gears is no longer Gears of War, or we can continue to criticize and give feedback on the game, in the hopes that it becomes better and that the next entry in the franchise lives up to the legacy of the former games and brings the IP back into former glory. So to properly demonstrate how this game has lost what it means to be a Gears game, we need to look into all the changes more in depth, starting with one that had defined the original series and cemented the game as one worthy of the mature rating, and that's the gore. It's no secret that one of the first pillars of the Gears franchise that immediately set it apart from other third-person shooter games was its gore. In Gears 1, this aspect was almost a selling point all on its own, as the gore at the time was amongst some of the most realistic ever seen in gaming. Depending on what weapon you use and where you shot someone at, you could see organs, bones, rib cages, and more. While some people who aren't Gears fans might have looked at this as some kind of weird fetish, we Gears fans liked the gore because it added a lot to the game. The gore in the original Gears games, especially 1 and 2, added much more weight to the dark and gritty atmosphere. In video games, if you see an NPC or teammate get shot and the body disappears or they turn into a magical crate, it doesn't feel quite as impactful. However, when you see this monstrous creature rip apart an ally,
A berserker. She can hear us. She can smell us.
Oh man, her blood! Her blood! I'm getting out of here!
It adds a lot to that horror aspect, because we the players realize not only might our friends and families be shot by these inhumane, genocidal monsters, but they might be torn apart and tortured to a state where they are barely recognizable.
Maria.
Dom.
Marcus. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do, man.
No. It's okay.
Besides the gore, adding a horrifying element to the original games that made us not just hate the Locusts, but also be terrified of what they might do to us, it also made the weapons and actions by the player that much more satisfying. For a game to be fun to play, players have to receive audio and visual feedback of their actions. When you shoot an enemy, you need to see your bullets are doing damage. Yes, it may look a little cheesy at times when blood constantly just sprays out when unloading clips into an enemy, but when their head pops off from a long shot or one-shot round, their body explodes from a boom shot or Nasher shell, or of course, when their body falls into two pieces after a chainsaw kill, it feels so much more satisfying, because the game has provided the player with a tremendous amount of visual feedback for their actions. And there's no question of whether or not an enemy is just wounded or dead. If they explode, they're not getting back up. Now to be fair, the gore debatably reached its peak in Gears 2, with the gore being toned down a little in Gears 3, but in Gears 4 and especially 5, the gore is nothing like the originals. Now bodies seem to always react the same to chainsaws, and explode in similar ways, no matter where they're shot at and what kills them. And to make matters worse, when you look up close, gone are the realistic looking insides, and instead, everything looks like red jelly paste. This not only ruins the horror aspect in the campaign, but severely damages the player's reaction to killing enemies in PvE and PvP game modes. The Coalition has stated adding back the original gore would be a tremendous cost on resources and have little player impact, therefore it's not worth it. However, I would argue that it has an astonishing impact on players and is well worth the resources. Plus it would show the community that Gears is actually returning to its roots. And while this might not be possible in Gears 5, I really hope the Coalition implements proper gore in Gears 6. Along with the gore being downgraded, the art style has also changed dramatically. Now let's get one thing straight. Gears 5's graphics really are insane, and the fact that this game runs at native 4K and 60 FPS on the Xbox One X really is incredible, and it's clear that the Coalition know how to utilize the Unreal Engine pretty well. And when you're exploring the frozen forest or red sand deserts, the game looks amazing, and you can even take your breath away when you encounter the cursed wind flares. However, with that said, while the game does look amazing, it does seem a little too colorful and a bit oversaturated at times. Now I do realize that in Gears 1, the game was very much full of almost exclusively a gray and brown color palette, with only the flashes of bullets, the maroon reds of blood, and the yellow emulsion serving as breaks away from the usual colors. But because the color palette was very simplistic and made those other aspects of the game stand out. And it added a lot to the feeling of the game taking place in a war-torn world where humanity was losing. Now Gears 2 did add more color and environmental variety, with snow and a proper display of the plants and environments found in the Locust Hollows. But this still felt like a natural progression of the series, and it still had that horror element to many of the environments, especially inside of that rift worm. Then after I revisited Gears 3 again, I do have to admit, the game was filled with a lot more color, and at times, it might have felt a little too colorful for what was supposed to be humanity's absolute last stand. But it still wasn't overbearing or distracting. In fact, I think it was a good blend of the Gears atmosphere along with the extra color that many critics had wanted to see. However, with that said, Gears 4 and 5 are dramatically more colorful than the older games. Towns and cities are no longer painted in darker grays, but instead in bright golden browns and yellows. And everything in COG territory seems bathed in kiddish blues and yellow. It also doesn't help that even the enemies now also seem more brightly colored, and are filled with either light on their armor or glowing yellow crystals sticking out of them. I think the swarm themselves look decent, but it's hard to feel afraid of many of them when they look so colorful. And if the swarm don't have much of a scary look to them, it certainly doesn't help out that the DBs are also the same bright COG colors. And still some of the most boring and lazy enemies to fight. Robots that walk in a straight line aren't scary, and the swarm, while a fun and decent faction to fight against, lacked the variety and horrifying look that made the Locust such a memorable and terrifying enemy to fight. Yes, the Lambent were more colorful, but we saw pretty vividly what the Lambent could do to Locust, and they still had a scary zombie/ghoul appearance to them, which kept them well within the horror element, combining the environments all looking happy and oversaturated, along with more brightly lit and colored enemies. The game's art style just doesn't seem to bear any resemblance to that dark series that many of us love so much. Now don't get me wrong, I think some areas of Gears 5 really do look amazing, and some designs of the Swarm, such as the Warden and Scions, do look great, but I think colors should be used a little more sparingly, environments should have a darker atmosphere, and enemies should be a little less colorful, and have designs more centered around that horror element. While the art style might not share much with the old Gears trilogy, at least it still has some sense of Gears in it, which is more than I can say for the game's soundtrack. The Gears soundtrack may not be as popular or celebrated as the infamous Halo games, but when you go back and play the first 3 Gears games, it's clear they had a very iconic and unique soundtrack, and while the tone of the songs may have changed from game to game, you can still tell they had a unifying theme across the trilogy. Here's what some of those stellar combat themes sounded like in Gears 1. And here's that incredibly memorable Locust theme. And finally, here's the Gears 1 menu theme. In Gears 1, the music had this scary, orchestrated, and bombastic themes that aligned perfectly with what was happening on screen. It had such uniqueness to it that for all of us longtime fans, we can still remember each note crystal clear. The soundtrack painted a picture of war, desperation, horror, and mystery. Then in Gears 2, with the game more centered around the player, feeling like they were part of a large military fighting off the Locusts for the good of all mankind instead of a single squad, the music now had much more of a heroic feel to it. This can be heard in the action music along with the fan favorite song Heroic Assault, which was used in the amazing Prescott speech.
Humans are no strangers to war. After all, we've been fighting for as long as we can remember. War is all we know. They've brought with them a force that can sink entire cities. Even Jacinto, our last beacon of hope through all these dark days, is now at risk. Soon we'll have nothing left to defend. And that means we have only one option. Attack. Gears, what I ask of you now is not an easy thing.
This sense of heroism was carried throughout many of the songs and put on incredible display during the finale, which really made it feel like you had just completed a masterpiece of a game and had put a serious dent into the Locust, but there were still more fights to come. However, the darker themes were still prevalent in the game, and the Locust theme simply received an update, and the menu music still sounded and felt very much like Gears. Then in Gears of War 3, the themes not only had a much darker and desperate tune to them, and it really could be understood through the music alone that this was truly a dark time for humanity, but through a willingness to survive and prosper, and a refusal to lay over and die, and instead fight to the bitter end, was expressed in every note of that stellar soundtrack. The menu music and themes throughout the game all still sounded and felt like Gears at its core, and this was a damn good conclusion for the series, and the soundtrack exemplified that. After Epic had concluded its trilogy though, and the Coalition had taken over the IP, Gears 4 was their first original go at the series. And honestly it wasn't bad. which should be expected as the composer behind the soundtrack is the same guy responsible for the Game of Thrones soundtrack, and one of the only good aspects of that awful Season 8. The main theme still felt a little like Gears, or rather the origins of a new threat and a new war, and the main menu theme was a pleasant one, but overall the soundtrack just doesn't sound like Gears of War. And then here in Gears 5, the theme song seems to have zero correlation with the franchise, and instead sounds like a generic military song that could be used in any game. Again, these songs aren't bad, and I do generally enjoy some of the songs in the soundtrack, like the Sandworld Overture. But it just doesn't feel like Gears. This is the same kind of issues that 343 Industries faced with Halo 4, where most fans agreed the soundtrack was good, but not very Halo. The point is, while it's okay to modernize and remaster themes and etc., sequels to a long and beloved running franchise should still have music that sounds like the rest of the series. And right now what Gears 5 has is good music, but it's not Gears music. In fact, even the tone and feeling of Gears 5 overall just doesn't feel like Gears, but instead a Frankenstein attempt to combine everything popular and modern into one game, desperately hoping something sticks. Gears of War used to be a game centered around a dark and gritty story with large set pieces and linear but meaningful point A to B levels, with some room for exploration and going off the beaten path. It used to mean having a multiplayer with tons of in-universe characters based off the Gears world. It used to be about having lots of customization that didn't break the immersion too much. It used to be about brotherhood, friendships, and camaraderie against a truly evil force. And finally, the marketing used to be about showing how bad it was to live in the world of Gears, but how it was a world where our favorite characters had no other choice but to endure and fight on a daily basis in the hopes for a better tomorrow. But now Gears 5 doesn't even live on many of these same rules, and seemingly has tried to adapt any and every single popular mechanic and marketing tool. First, while the game still has large set pieces that do feel truly epic, the first and second acts suffer tremendously for their horrible attempt to include open world areas. Open world games are definitely a trend right now, as almost all games try and follow a mixture of the Skyrim and Far Cry world formats. But for a game to be good, it doesn't need to be open world. And here in Gears 5, the way it's implemented, it certainly seems like it was done simply for a buzzword. At least in Halo 3 ODST, when they included an open world, the city was fun to explore, vast and expansive with lots of verticality, and most importantly, included enemy patrols that could be completed in a wide variety of ways by the player. In Gears 5, Mount Kadar and Vaskar aren't really open worlds. They're fancy level select screens or vast empty areas you're forced to traverse, often for minutes at a time, just to reach the next actual level. No enemies patrol the wastelands between, nor are there many secrets to discover. This was an example of how not to do an open world well. Next, the multiplayer customization still remains abysmal compared to past Gears games, with most of the campaign characters still not playable, and the majority of Delta Squad nowhere in sight. But most importantly, in the original Gears trilogy, while the games did allow some wacky weapon camos, the player models were still grounded and more realistic for the universe. Then in Gears 4, while now the game has a ton of good character skins, there was still a plethora of cartoonish and goofy looking ones that almost no adult or Gears veteran would enjoy. This isn't game breaking by any means, but it does make the whole multiplayer look much sillier and kid friendlier than ever before. Also, the new inclusion of Halo Reach characters, Terminator characters, and Batista might be fun for some, but I think this makes Gears 5 look even less like Gears and more like a mess, as now fans are asking for all kinds of silly crossovers. When the game has more out-of-universe characters than in-universe characters, it starts to feel like a crappy Xbox version of Super Smash Bros., and it's really immersion breaking. Moving on from the game breaking immersion constantly, the game's tone and manner in which characters act toward one another seems to be much more hostile and selfish. Now I won't go into too much detail here, as I'll cover this much more extensively in my campaign video, but with games and media mostly serving as a form of escapism, Gears 5 oddly enough seems like it just wants to try and find ways to mirror the current US politics, and it doesn't do it very subtly. No, I really don't like talking about politics, but it's pretty clear which side of the aisle the coalition stands on. I think instead of making a story focused on character drama, pushing away the old faces of Gears, and creating a game very focused on war ethics and militaristic imperialism, the coalition should have instead made a game more like Gears 2. In the sense that it feels like everyone, despite their differences, is fighting for a good common goal, and that working together is better than working against one another. This was a highlight of Mass Effect 3 and Halo 3. Why? Because people love a tale of coming together as one, and instead this game seems like it wants to create a division. I'm sure a lot of people will disagree with me here, but I also want the series to focus more on JD again, as I think the Phoenix family is just as important to Gears as Master Chief is to Halo. Halo 5 tried to have a new face, and that didn't turn out too well for them, so I think the Coalition needs to be careful with whom they decide needs to carry the franchise. Now I can already tell that some people in the comments are going to say I'm sexist, but just like when I play Tomb Raider, I expect to play as Lara Croft, and would be equally as upset if I had to play as her boyfriend. In fact, one of my best friends, who's one of the most liberal people that I know, also didn't enjoy playing as Kate. My dislike of her has nothing to do with politics, although I think the Coalition knew that by doing so would garner a lot of good faith amongst the Access media, as they all immediately clamored to type up articles about how bold this is and how this is so much better for the gaming community. Again, I don't want to talk about politics, and I'm not trying to offend anyone. After all, I'm an Indian-Italian mix living in the Deep South, but I care more about great stories and worlds than genders and identity politics. I play games for escapism, but that's just my 2 cents. The last small detail that shows Gears 5 doesn't feel like Gears of War is the change of marketing. Throughout Gears 1, 2, and 3, we've had a sad trailer for each game, which quickly sums up the mood and tone of each entry. Look at the trailers we had for the first 3 games.
Very, very mad. I cannot bear to hear them.
And then surprisingly, we had another fantastic trailer for Gears 4, that at least for me, was also jam-packed full of heart and emotion. Yet once again for Gears 5, the game's first couple trailers range from just plain weird to feeling like a kid-friendly game, with music that is a decade behind the times. Now eventually we did finally get a more appropriate Gears 5 trailer later on, but even then, it still didn't strike those same Gears chords of nostalgia that it so desperately wanted to. There's so many examples in Gears 5 where it wants to try and cater to the old school fans, but with so much extra crap added in to try and appeal to any video game fan ever, it ends up feeling like a game that's lost and struggling to find both its identity and an audience. Gears 5 is a very conflicted game. It looks beautiful, runs smoothly, and has some truly great moments, but it also feels like a game that doesn't really want to be a Gears game. The old beloved cast is being pushed aside in both the story and multiplayer. The physics, destruction, and of course the gore have all been severely toned down. The horror atmosphere and gritty color palette has been replaced by a bright game infused with overly saturated colors. The music, while good, sounds nothing like the older Gears games. The story now focuses on war ethics and character drama over being brothers to the end, and the game has tried to include every trending game mechanic, including bland open world segments, character ultimate abilities, RPG upgrades and loot, weird crossovers, and so much more. The game losing the of war in the title and simply being called Gears 5 seems to accurately demonstrate that this is no longer the series that we love. Gears 5 is very much following the same path that 343 Industries followed of Halo 5. Halo 5 proved to be incredibly divisive and was hated by much of the community. The game had a new protagonist, implemented useless features in the campaign, had a divisive multiplayer, included terrible microtransactions, had an insultingly small amount of content at launch, lost its identity, and even changed their name from Halo 5 to Halo 5 Guardians. This all sounds pretty similar to what's happening here. With Halo though, the fans complained, and the developers heard their cries. And from this, the next entry, Halo Infinite, is being built almost entirely around what the fans want, and is being based around the original games, in terms of what made Halo, Halo. So now it's up to us Gears fans to voice our complaints to the Coalition and let them know that if they and Microsoft want the franchise to once again be a system seller and return to its former glory, then the path to do so is by making Gears feel like Gears again. With Gears 5, the game would need an overhaul, but with Gears 6, we the fans can still save the franchise. I truly do hope the Coalition changes course and evolves for the better. If they do, then I'll sing their praise as loud as I can. But if they don't, well then I'm sorry to say, but I won't be returning for Gears 6. as it truly is saddening to see one of my all-time favorite franchises transform into a husk of its former self. Well, that wraps up this video on how Gears 5 has lost its identity and failed at being a Gears game. So let me know what you think down in the comments, and as always, my Twitter account and Patreon are linked down below. And this video was made in part thanks to the generous support from Shane Cruz. With that said, let's chat down in the comments, and if you like this video and want to see more like it, be sure to leave a like, share the video, and hit that subscribe button. And I'll see you all on the next Shepherd Gaming video. Kila Salai.